The Tet Offensive happened just as I was arriving, and I didn't get up to my assigned post with the 1st Air Cav Division until 2 weeks later, because I didn't have that assignment when I left the States. I had to stay in the replacement company in Saigon for, I don't know, it was about 3 or 4 days, and then shipped up to a location in An Khe, which is about the middle of Vietnam. And that was where the 1st Air Cav Division had been fighting for the previous, I don't know, maybe 2 years. And then after I joined the division in An Khe, that's when I finally got my assignment to a unit within the division. The division was in the process of actually moving up to I Corps. So everything was very dynamic and very subject to change.
You arrive as Tet is unfolding.
Yeah.
Before your plane touched down and you landed at Benoit, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So before your plane lands at Benoit, did you know that things had broken loose in South Vietnam?
Actually, no. Obviously, in the training, and I was on. I had leave just before I left for Vietnam for a week or so, and while on leave, I wasn't exactly watching the news.
Yeah.
I figured whatever my fate was, it'll be determined when I get there, because I had no idea where I was going to be assigned.
How long were you on the ground before you learned that before you learned about what was happening as a result of the Tet Offensive?
Well, while I was at An Khe, we were going sort of through a orientation to the division's type of tactics and methods of fighting. Again, even then, I didn't know what role I was going to play, but they briefed us on what was going on. And
what was the first thing you saw or experienced that drove home the point to you that you had arrived in a war zone?
Well, it wasn't long, because when we arrived on the plane, it was the middle of the night, even in the morning hours. And then they drove us to the barracks where the arrivees would stay for the few days. And while that was happening, there was a mortar attack on Benoit, or that general area, and you could hear it. You could hear the concussions and stuff. It wasn't near where we were. It wasn't against traffic on the road that we took, but it was immediately aware that there was something going on. I think as I reflect on it now, I think I was just accepting of that I was there, that I was going to go through whatever was going to happen, and I had no way of anticipating that. So the nervousness, the anxiety was shared with a lot of the other individuals that were there, all of whom, none of whom really knew where they were going. They weren't all pilots. There was a mix of, we were with officers. I was a commissioned officer. So we were with other officers, but nobody knew what their assignments were going to be at that point. Right. So just knowing you're in a war zone, and there's really not much you can do about it. And you just accept it and hope for the best. Once I got to the assignment in the 1st Cav Division, I ended up being assigned to the scout platoon. And they pretty much flew the smaller observation helicopters. Just as I got there, they were starting to get into service, the LOH-6A Loaches, the Cayuse. And then they started immediately transition all new pilots to that platform.
What was the basic mission? You have a lot of missions. I think nearly 200 combat missions, if I remember correctly.
Right.
So there are a lot of different missions, but generally, what would be the basic missions of the helo that you're flying?
Right. That's a good question. The squadron, the 1st of the 9th Air Cavalry Squadron, within the 1st Air Cav Division, was the primary role that we served was to hunt and find the enemy wherever they may have been at that moment in time.
Mhm.
The squadron was broken up into 3 different platoons. One was a scout platoon, which is where I was. The second was a gunship platoon, and the third was a lift platoon. So the lift platoon carried the infantry, and the gunships were obviously gunships, and then the scout ships were the ones that we flew. So that was our call signs were white for the scouts, and so my call sign was white 11. The gunships were red, and the lift platoons were blue. So the call signs for the different units were utilized or assigned in that manner. The scout flew low because we had to look and observe and find signs of the enemy on the ground. And the gunships flew up at altitude, typically 2,000 to 3,000 feet, depending on the terrain. And then they would be there to cover us. And basically the mission, if we were shot at or fired at, or we saw something that looked suspicious, and we would investigate further. If anything happened that, we would get on the radio and say receiving fire, and we drop smoke grenades onto the enlisted people in my crew. And then the gunships would roll in and suppress the fire, so to speak, as we evaded the area. The missions were quite varied. They were everywhere. Much of the missions on a daily basis, there was what we call the first light and last light missions. These were patrols where we flew basically around this, probably a mile out, maybe not quite a mile out from the perimeter of Camp Evans, and we would scout the area as sun was setting and as sun was rising in the morning. And that was mainly to detect any movement of troops closer to the border, and the distance chosen to do those missions was at the limit of their rocket and mortar range. That was a common mission that happened every day, basically, unless weather conditions prevented it. We had a lot of bad monsoon-like weather. So other than that, the missions that I flew on were as far north as Quezon, when we were trying to help the Marines bail out of that location. We had missions throughout the mountainous areas west of Camp Evans, up to the valley, the Ashau Valley.
Okay.
And then we also had missions closer to shore, to the sea, which were mainly rice paddies and villages. The enemy was there. The enemy was pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
And then of course the Ashau Valley were the 2 major missions that we participated in.
The mission of this helo you're in, the Loach, is to hunt and find. And
Right.
then in your diary, you mentioned a number of times, we took out a hooch, we took out 2 hooches, this sort of thing. How would you determine what to take out and what not to take out as you're out on patrol?
I think that would come pretty much just from experience, not necessarily my experience, but the experience of the more senior pilots that were already there and had been flying missions, and the intelligence that our military was receiving as to where the heaviest presence of the enemy was located. And it was common that they were in the mountainous areas. I think I'm going to be guessing, but as I said, Camp Evans was about a mile from the ocean shore, and another mile and a half, 2 miles to where the hills started. And then not even a mile when you got to really significantly high mountains, up to 4,000, 5,000 feet high. So, and the enemy could be present in any of those locations.
And were there free fire zones where then anything that's moving, any human activity in this area is just assume it's enemy?
Yes, we obviously knew where our units were located that were inserted into the different areas that we were fighting in. So as long as we stayed away from those areas and they were identified for us, not that it was always that easy to find them when we would go out on missions, but for the most part, from the maps that we had and the briefings that would take place prior to going out on missions, they would point that out. So in the mountains, everything was free fire except for friendly locations. On the rice paddies in the areas around Camp Evans, there were villages that were labeled as friendly. There were other villages that were labeled as unknown because we didn't know. And unless we took fire from them, we would generally not fire upon villages. So we were much more cautious around civilians. Plus the enemy presence there was not as, that was the Viet Cong military that pretty much worked in the areas around these smaller villages. Mountains, that was the North Vietnamese army, the regulars, that pretty much occupied the different locations. And then when you get to the valley, the A Shau Valley, that's where the Ho Chi Minh Trail comes in from Laos. So then the times that we were there, there was heavy presence of the NVA military throughout that area.
You mentioned in your diary flying over Vietnamese peasants working in their fields, the rice fields, and you say that some of them don't even look up. What comes to your mind when you bring those images to your mind of the Vietnamese peasants down in the field? Maybe they're BC, maybe they're not. You can't know a lot of the time. What thoughts do you have about those folks?
The thoughts are one of caution. So you don't know their real status. The fact that they're out there tending their fields, the rice fields, rice paddies that were primarily the method of agriculture that was common there and in many parts of Vietnam.
Sure.
We just accepted them for who they appeared to be. We weren't looking for them. Although there were times that when we flew over some villages, we would get fired at. Not hit necessarily. One of the first experiences, which they can't give you in training in the States, was the sound of rounds going by the helicopter. And basically it's a crack. It's a very sharp crack of a round flying by at supersonic speed. You're basically hearing the sound wave of the rounds going by. So the first few times that happens, you get the little chill up your back. Because you just came close. If in fact you might get hit, then one of the first experiences of my aircraft being hit was a hole in the rotor blade, which we only discovered when we got back to the base camp and shut down and inspected the aircraft. Oh, look at that.
Wow. Now you could hear the crack of the bullets. I'm guessing because I've heard that the Loach was a relatively quiet helicopter. Is that right?
Yes, which made it an advantage as far as when you're flying, unless you're flying in a wide open, like the rice paddies, they can see you coming no matter where they are. But in the mountains, they would not see you until you were right over them. So yes, it wasn't so much silent, it was a very high frequency whir of the rotator, not like the whop, whop, whop of the Hueys, and that has to do with the sound waves coming off the blades. I was on a mission on one of the trip close to the city of Way. We had gotten reports from friendly units that were on the ground there doing normal patrols. We had gotten called out by our friendly units on the ground that they encountered enemy troops moving through the area. And so we were called out on the mission. It was close to last light, so I was going to combine it with a last light mission and then go out and check out this particular area to see if there was any concentration of troops. By the time I got out there and I started to kind of slow down my motion a little bit, and again, this is an area that there were trees, not just flat rice paddies. So I couldn't see at a distance whether troops were present or not from visual sighting. But as I was going along a tributary to the river, which went east of Way City, or actually north of Way City, I was going through that river because we would commonly find these guys on their little boats coming down the river. That's how they would travel greater distances more quickly and more easily. So I was kind of targeting that river as a place to try to identify where they might be moving. And so I was going slower than I normally would have gone, you know, to take advantage of that silence and the speed of the aircraft to avoid direct hits. And as I was cruising along the river, there was some trees overhanging the river, and I was on the opposite side of the river. And as I was looking, I spotted an individual up under the bank, and he had his boat, his little boat with him. It was just a single individual as best as I could see. And I saw him just as I got over him. Obviously, at that point, he saw me. And I actually saw him raising his AK-47, which that's what it was. He was raising it. I shouted to my crew, you know, target left side. And I shoved the cyclic over, which tilted the aircraft forward to get out of the way. But he let off I don't know, a large number of rounds. He probably emptied his clip because I didn't see him reload. And then I could feel the impact on the aircraft. The aircraft was being hit by the bullets. I mean, it was not a major vibration, but a small one. But I knew I was taking hit. I told my observer who sits on the right side of the aircraft, you know, I said, drop smoke. I'm on the radio with the gunship. I said, unload on the mark, meaning the smoke grenade. And then I bailed out, you know, to the right to get away from that particular area. Normally, I might have just stayed there to see what would happen after the gunship rolled in. But my crew chief got on the radio and indicated that he'd been wounded. He took a shot through the knee. So fortunately, this was like, you know, not more than a 10-minute flight back to Camp Evans, where the medevac areas were located. So I immediately turned and headed back toward Camp Evans. Just as I started to do that, apparently some of the rounds that came into the aircraft hit the transmission lines, and I started to get transmission oil coming down the inside of the bubble, which meant I couldn't see where I was going. So I flew sideways. I just went like that and flew sideways for the 5 or 10 minutes that it took to get to the medevac, put it down, shut the aircraft down, and then that's when my crew chief, not the crew chief, the observer, he went and he looked and he examined it and he counted the 27 bullet holes, starting like inches behind where I was sitting, which would have made sense from the fact that I could see him to my left.
Wow.
So that was my first scary experience.
At the moment, when you're back on base, you spend your night there, and you got to go back to work the next day. At the time, was that just another day in the NOM, or did that incident have any particular impact on you at the time, or not?
Well,
So,
yeah, I think the immediate result was I was concerned about my crew chief, and as I wrote in the diary, they did evacuate him to a hospital outside of Vietnam, I think to the Philippines.
mhm,
And after he got stabilized, in our location, and I mean, the anxiety that builds up, you're not it's the adrenaline that's just pumping through you as experiencing it, and as it's actually happening. And then, did I think about it? I'm sure I did. I mean, I don't have memories of every thought that it was going through.
right.
But even on a day-to-day basis, I mean, you realize and you understand that any given mission that you're sent out on could be a bad one. And I've certainly had my share of experiences, not just being shot at, but even the dangerous flying in mountainous terrain where wind conditions are extremely unpredictable. And as the first staff was withdrawing and heading south, the 101st Airborne started moving in, and they wanted to work with one of the air cavalry troops to sort of acclimate themselves to introducing air mobile operations, helicopter operations into their fighting force. So B Troop, who I was in, got the assignment to go and do a similar thing for them that we did for the first Cav back in April. So it meant going back to the valley, which I wasn't particularly thrilled at, because it's a dangerous area to fly in, and it's a wide open western frontier in terms of the types of operations that would take place. So the first 5 days of getting back into the valley involved basically an examination of the valley. At that point, it was in the same areas that we had been in back in April. And we spent our troop was the primary force that went out and did the search and the examination, where the enemy was at that moment in time, identifying landing zones where infantry could be inserted. I mean, pretty much we had a lot of that information already from observations from fixed wing aircraft at the tube, but in our case, we were able to get down at the ground level and take a closer exam of the areas to identify whether troops were there, enemy troops were there, or whether it was appropriate to use as a landing zone. So there was a mix of different types of missions.
Yeah.
So there were 5 days. The first 4 days, all of our aircraft was taking hits. A few were shot down. So on the 5th day, that was going to be our last day of searching and examining the different areas. And then the next day, that's when they were going to insert both South Vietnamese military and the 101st Airborne were going to be inserted. And I think it was my second mission of the day. I had been out early in the morning and didn't encounter anything, didn't receive any fire. But then on the second mission around lunchtime, I went back in, and I don't know if you could picture in your mind, the valley is kind of a low point in this mountainous area. The trails from the valley go out in different directions toward Laos, which connects eventually with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that's how the enemy would infiltrate into the area.
Sure.
So despite the fact that we were there in April and pushed them out and suppressed their incursion into that area, we left
Hmm.
end of April, and obviously they reoccupied the
Yeah.
valley. I mean, that was one of the frustrating things about being in a war where you didn't permanently occupy an area to keep the enemy out. We did it to inflict casualties, and to let them know that we could do that and we could do it quickly, like an air mobile division is supposed to be able to.
Yeah.
But that second mission that day, I came to the valley over the mountains, and as I got to the first ridge line, I would come down out of altitude, going across the mountains. We're up at 8,000 feet. And as we approached the valley, I came down at a fairly steep glide slope down along that last ridge line, and then out into the valley at elephant grass level, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And then moving at a pretty good clip, since we knew they were there. We didn't want to be hovering like I had done that one time, and that was only the month before that I suffered that close call. And now in the morning missions in the previous days, I had flown almost completely across the valley to the mountains that were on the other side bordering Laos. But in this particular case, I didn't get more than a few minutes into the valley. And then once again, as I looked down below me, and this is all bang, 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 that's how fast it happens.
Right.
It wasn't one guy lifting his AK-47, it was many guys.
Wow.
They all popped up. They actually had their elephant grass camouflage. I could see that in their military gear, in their clothing, and on their helmets. So they were using that as hiding. And most of the time, they probably did hide and didn't call attention to themselves, because they knew if they did, that within 15, 20 minutes, there'd be Air Force jets dropping rounds on them. So why they chose to shoot at me at that moment in time, I have no clue.
Wow.
But they opened up, I mean, and literally the aircraft just shuddered as it started taking hits. And mostly to the front, the bubble shattered. I could hear the rounds hitting the control panel, which was kind of in the center of and to the front of the aircraft. I again bailed out. My crew dropped smoke. I contacted the gunship Cobra that was covering for me. And then as I bailed out and headed back, there was a sense of smoke or something in the atmosphere inside the aircraft. And then the gunship actually called me on the radio and said, White 1-1, you're trailing smoke. How is your aircraft or something? I don't remember the exact words that they used. And my crew chief in the back, said, it looks like, we're burning or we're on fire or whatever the case. He was just reacting to the smoke.
Wow.
So I bailed out quickly, and I headed back to an area that was an old French airstrip that we used in the April operation as a staging area. It's called LOH. It used to be a French airstrip back in those days in the 50s. And I basically chose that as a place to put the aircraft down just in case it really was on fire. We set it down. I wasn't about to take my time using the normal protocols of shutting down an aircraft. I just did the instinctive things, shutting off the fuel flow, shutting off the throttle, and then bailed out. And the crew did the same. They bailed out. We went to a bomb crater that was off to the side and sat there and waited. Oh, the thing I forgot to mention was on operations like this, where risk is very high, in addition to having a gunship flying support at altitude, there was always a lift ship on station waiting, if necessary, to pick up crews that would go down. So as soon, and we're all on the same radio frequency, so they knew what was going on. And they already started rolling in. As soon as they saw me put the aircraft down, they started to roll in. And I mean, it felt like quite a bit of time, but it would probably was less than 5 minutes. They were there and picked this up.
You're in the valley in these NBA, I'm
Yeah,
assuming NBA, they've got the camouflage, and then a bunch of them stand up simultaneously and aim their AKs at you.
right.
How close were you to them? Just guessing.
Well, we were at elephant grass level, so
Oh my God.
so I mean that, whatever the distance, elephant grass was quite high, it was
Yeah.
like 20 feet high. So they were probably on a trail where they were moving from one area to another. So if I'm 10 feet above that, they're no more than 100 to 200 feet away from me. At that
What
moment in time, and then I'm quickly bailing out and getting away from them. But that at that moment, that's how close it is, and that was the same at that incident in April. I'm not in April, in July, where I found that guy on the river. That's how far we were.
Wow. Is that one of those instances where, we're talking about something that's, that comes and goes, in, I don't know, 15 seconds, maybe something like that. But is that one of those instances where it almost becomes a slow motion kind of event? I mean,
Yeah, I've heard that description, and that used by many pilots, and both military and non-military. Even the American Airlines flight that landed in the Hudson River.
mm,
That's how those pilots talked about it in that
mm,
sense. To me, it happened as fast as I felt it.
mm,
There was no slow motion. It was just get the hell out of there and avoid damage. It was the only time that I actually had to put the aircraft down outside of base camps. Was when that happened. And on operations like that again in the valley and other places, Quezon, and things of that nature, we'd always have aircraft at the staging areas waiting to go out and scramble in response to a severe incident, which you would classify this by putting the aircraft down.
mm.
And one of the gunships, usually the combinations of ships would vary depending on aircraft available and not on other missions. But I think it was a gunship and another, it was two gunships, I think, that responded when I put my aircraft down. They came out to assist or to cover any kind of recovery that the lift ships were making. As it turns out, we didn't need that, because I was far enough away from where the enemy were, but they came out anyway. And for whatever reason, they came down low level. And one of those gunships suffered damage from a rocket grenade launcher, from what we were told by the surviving crew members. The pilot and one of the crew members was killed. The other pilot and the other crew member were retrieved and picked up. But that ship went down, and the pilot of that ship was someone I had become friends with.
Is that Arvidsson?
Yes, that was him. So that was the extended nature of the mission. And the sad thing is, his being out there wasn't necessary, because I was already on the lift ship and being taken back to the staging area. So these incidents happen that quickly, and the responses are, not always controllable.
You write about this in your diary or something, as you're reading through your old diary. Then you add parenthetically that this incident with Arvidsson is something that bothered you after the war, and perhaps still does. And it seems that that this is common among war vets, that there are one or two things that just kind of dogged them, one or two memories that kind of dogged them of
Right.
the war. Um, and without any intention of prying, and so feel
Mhm.
free to bat this aside, but what is it about that? I mean, obviously it's a hard story that takes place in the context of combat.
Right.
What is it about this particular story that
I think,
has dogged you over the years?
yeah, I think uh, this is not unusual in any war. It happens in all the wars, the specific incidents that take place where you may feel that it was unnecessary, whether it's friendlies on the ground being hit by friendly fire only because of miscommunication or misidentifying of locations and things of that nature,
Yeah.
or artillery being sent in the wrong places. These things always happen. What particularly bothered me was that as we were rescued by the lift ship and being taken back to the staging area, nobody on that aircraft even asked me what happened, or what was my thoughts about it. And then that aircraft would have been in contact with the command at the staging area, which were sending the aircraft to come out and recover us or help in our recovery. So no one ever contacted me to say, was that necessary? Not that they would have under normal circumstances.
Mm.
These responses are instantaneous, and the courage of the pilots and crews that are in the midst of that kind of situation, you can't judge right or wrong at any moment of time. They're out there. I was friendly with the pilot, one of the pilots. In fact, in my diary, I mentioned a number of times we were building a recreation area and a bar and food building for the commissioned officers, for the officers in the squadron. And I was working with him and others on this. And then even when I got back to the staging area, I was not debriefed. No one came and talked to me about what I encountered, when I encountered it, where I encountered it. So it just felt like it, and I didn't find out about him going down and being killed until later that night.
Mm.
So I wasn't even aware because no one talked to me about it.
So is the sense of burden that, as you play the tape over in your mind and
Yeah,
do that, well, maybe this, maybe that,
right.
is it that, well, nobody asked me, but maybe I should have volunteered the information. I should have told somebody, or
Right. And again, under those conditions and situations, you're not always in control of what happens following it. This was late in the day, and they just ended up bringing me. In fact, they touched down in the staging area, but then continued the flight back to Camp Evans. So because they didn't know what condition the crew was in, so they brought us back to. There was no opportunity
right?
and talk to the command structure that
Sure.
was in the staging area at that particular time. As a matter of fact, I think they were even bailing out and going back to Evans themselves because that was the last day of the 5 days of our mission. There's a guilty aspect to this. I reflect back and say to myself, could I have flown that aircraft all the way back to the staging area, knowing I'd have to climb up to 7,000 feet and then come back down with an aircraft that was questionable, whether the fuel would last? I had no way of knowing.
Mm.
And so again, these are snap decisions that you make in the moment under the conditions that you're dealing with.
You have these kinds of experiences, and you mention others in your diary, who
Mhm.
were killed in action. And sometimes what happens is the combatant who's experiencing all of this becomes eager to go out and get them back, make them pay. And that's not what I'm picking up in your diary. Actually, there's an entry you wrote where you express relief that you don't have, that there weren't very many enemy that you recall, specifically, guys in your helo taking out, or you taking
Right.
out. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about that, why that, despite everything, and you're a good officer, you're a good helo pilot, you're doing your job, you're certainly making a contribution, but there's not that sense of, okay, I'm going to be extra
Right.
aggressive and I'm good there, it's payback
Right.
time. I don't get that feeling from you.
Right.
What was your own disposition?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the diary numerous times, it's not something that as when we started the conversation today, I had mentioned that they were pilots who were much more aggressive, much more assertive, and more often than not, those are the pilots that ended up getting shot down or killed because of their aggressiveness. But that's part of the role that we play.
Hmm.
I felt in the time that I was there that I performed all the missions I was asked to do in an appropriate manner. But most of the time, I would fly at faster speeds just to avoid the risk of being shot down and injuring or killing my crew or myself. And yet I felt I was still effective enough to do the job. In all the missions I flew, we identified enemy areas, encampments, and located, where they were by getting shot at,
Mm.
more frequently than not. And so there was no question in my mind that what I was doing was right. But no, I didn't have the intent in my head that I had to make them pay for another one of our crew that got shot down and killed, like those that came out to save me. I that attitude was never present in my mind. In fact, the one incident early, a mission around Quezon, we were out on a I think it was a first light mission, might have been something else, where the terrain around Quezon is horrendous. I mean, it had these huge pillars of mountains that created wind drafts and wind currents that you never knew when you were going to get it thrust up or thrust down
Mm.
in terms of the turbulence that existed.
Yeah.
But in one case, we were flying along an embankment, a hilly area filled with elephant grass. And again, we were low level going through it. And as we crossed the trail and I looked to my left, I saw a single enemy combatant standing there in the trail, standing, not walking, not running, not trying to be evasive, but just there. And I crossed the trail. So my visual of him was there and then gone. So I turned around and came back over the trail again a second time, and there he was, still there.
Hmm.
So I said to myself, I said, that's kind of odd, for him not trying to run away, because he obviously sees us. So I turned left this time so that my crew chief and my observer, they are the ones with the firepower, M16 in the front and M60 in the back, so they could take shots at the guy. We did that. We came back, they shot, they missed. So I contacted the gunship. I said, can you roll in and take out this guy? And even as we were doing that, he was still standing there. So my only conclusion was that he was there as a decoy and to draw in aircraft. And as we get close enough, we would be faced with the heavy fire that we had many other times. So whether the gunship got him or not, we didn't hang around to try to find out.
You do have to give a little grudging respect to this guy.
Oh,
He's just standing there, an easy target.
that's out of fear. I mean, because if they didn't do that, their commanding officer would probably shoot and kill them. Leaving the service and arriving back home in time to start college, full-time to finish my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. And I encountered a lot of students. The protests against Vietnam in 1970 onward were quite significant and intense. And the students, and there was a number of veterans, there was a few veterans that were there also. But we didn't partake in the protests. We listened when they spoke to us about it and kind of, just sort of nodded our head and acknowledged the challenges that the country faced and the difficulties associated with that type of war. But pretty much it didn't impact our education in that sense. It didn't interfere or cancel classes. So we were okay, at least the school that I went to.